Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros. Today I am going to talk about the essentials that you need to know just to play the dragon variation. This, as you might see, is the tabia position, very well known if you have seen the position f3, bishop d7, 2, c8, castles, knight f5. This is called the Yugoslav Attack, championed by Leonid Stein, who was a very prodigious player, grandmaster in the 70s, but he tragically passed away before he could actually have a stamp on history. Now, in this position, there are a couple of moves that you have to know how to handle. One of them is bishop h6, and the other one is if your opponent starts rolling you down with h4, h5. But let's start with bishop h6. Now, bishop h6 is a logical move, but is trying to get rid of the dragon bishop. However, this welcomes an idea of an exchange sacrifice that you need to know, and you have to play it when you get the chance. In this game, the legendary Dragoljub Velimirovic is playing black, who is famous for his wild Sicilian games and his variation, called Velimirovic variation. The big move here is bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, sort of luring the queen away. Now, normally in the dragon, the main issue starts if white manages to get the knight on d5, exchange of this last defender on f6, and after h5, h4, h5, we just get checkmated. However, Velimirovic expected that, and now comes the big move, Rook takes c3. Now, this looks like just a mediocre exchange sacrifice, but not so. In fact, it is a very strong idea. No longer does black have to fear any ideas of knight d5, and also white will have to contend with a very terrible pawn structure. Queen a5. A side note, this was actually played by Korchnoi himself. He played a5 here, a4 and queen c7 versus the super grandmaster Yefim Geller. But back to the game. Queen a5, immediately targeting the c-pawn and bringing in the rook with c8. Now, black really doesn't have to worry about anything anymore because h4, h5 is a little bit slow, as black could take on c3 and already feel very comfortable. Not to mention that knight takes h5 will be on tap in that case. e2, rook c8. So notice one thing that is very dragon specific. Once you start attacking, you do not stop. You have to keep on attacking until you checkmate or you don't. So that's what Velimirovic does exactly. He pushes the c pawn. Now, white can't really risk losing that pawn because that would be a pawn and a piece which would compensate for the exchange. Queen e3, queen b6, setting up a deadly little trick of knight c4, but at a high international level, nobody falls for that trick. a1, a5. And just as Korchnoi did, Velimirovic is trying to trap this bishop, because this bishop is still having some pressure on this king, and if we could get rid of it, knight c4 would gain in strength, setting up some mating threats and threats on the queen. Knight f5, a very nice tricky move. You cannot capture it, the queen is hanging. But Velimirovic is more than happy to get into the endgame as he wins a pawn. So now he has a pawn and a piece for the exchange, that is a rook. Now, if you would look at a normal position, you'd say that it is clearly white who's better. But not in this case, because these rooks on a1 and d1 are still very passive, and there's a lack of coordination between the white pieces. Knight d5, knight takes d5, bishop d5, b5. A strong move trying to fix these targets on c2 and a2. b2, b4. Now, black has full compensation and control, as there's no way of breaking the position open, and rook d3 does not work just yet. The knight is guarding that square. So therefore, f4 is played, but Velimirovic knows how to play these positions, as he plans to set up some threats of forking those rooks and maybe even to slalom to c4. Rook e1, e6, chasing the bishop away. Now e6 is a very concrete move which only works if black has an advantage and you want to preserve it, or it has an immediate plan behind it. This e6 move actually has a deep idea behind it. You go bishop b3, then it would get trapped with a4. And after bishop b7, knight e3 was Velimirovich's big idea. If you go rook c1, knight c4 check, and slowly but surely black would be pushing away white. Black is near winning, but in any case dominating the position. So rook e3 was played, rook e3, rook takes d6, bishop b5, e5, a4, rook b6. And seemingly everything is alright for white. However, there is one big issue. That is tactics, which is always the big issue versus the dragon. a3 check, b3. Now you can't really take that bishop because b takes a2 and there's promotion. If you take rook c3 check, rook takes b3. Quite a unique sacrifice by Velimirovich. The point being, if you take, as happened in the game, a2, there is no rook a6 because I capture and you don't have enough time to check and go there because your bishop is in the way, blocking the view, and queening is unstoppable. Takes, queens, rook b4, g5. And now black is just blasting open white structure, so white can't even hope for a fortress anymore, and black is just basically winning. Takes, queen a5, always pin it to win it. King c3, queen takes c5, king d3, queen c5, queen b5, picking up another pawn. b3, king g7, h6, takes, e5, king c5, f5, queen b8, bishop e6, and white lost, but it is already hopeless with king g5. Black is almost ready to notch up the point with those two pawns down the board. So all in all, what we learned, exchange sacrificing is an important part of playing the dragon. But that is not the only thing you need to know to play this variation. The second game is played between two legends, Lyubomir Yuboyevich and Tony Miles. And as we go back and start from this position, as we're going to fast forward to that critical one that we just peeked at for a millisecond, this is, again, the critical position, and here black plays h5. Now, knight e5 deserves a mention. Knight e5 is definitely an option here, and at the end of the day, if long castles, knight c4, and accepting the pawn with h5 with knight takes h5. However, this can get very delicate, as after bishop h6, black, as we all know, has to eliminate this knight in due time. So there's this very nice move of knight takes c4. If knight takes c4, there's rook d4, and black is better. But after queen e3, there is this in-between rook takes c3 exchange sacrifice, very typical, bc, knight f6, and black is in the game. However, h5 is the most reliable move as played by the 80s superstar Tony Miles. Castles, knight e5, g4. Now, Lyubomir Yuboyevich is going in for the kill with g4. However, this pawn has to be and should be taken. h5, knight takes h5, bishop h6. Now, in any other cases, we could come up with any other ideas of trying to save this position. One of the typical idea is a rook c5, but that doesn't really work that much because knight d5 is coming and then black will face some difficulties. Rook c3 is a little bit slow because there's bishop g7 and white does not have to ruin his structure. Let's say takes, bishop g7 takes, queen takes c3, and black is in deep trouble. Even if you take on f3, knight takes f3, gf, rook takes h5, and this is already lost because after gh there's queen g5 and you can't stop checkmate on g7. Bishop is pinned. Therefore, the big move in bishop h6 is e6. Now, black already up some pawns and having a position where the queen is needed. Goes for e6, kind of smothering the view of this bishop on b3 and making sure that there are no queen g5 ideas anymore. That would be a problem and was a problem as he's seen in the previous example. Let's say rook h5, gh. There is no queen g5 anymore because I just simply capture. Rook g1, bishop h6 will be the idea, but first queen f6, bishop takes, and the whole point of it is, if after f takes g4, there is bishop h6, queen takes, queen f4 check, and without the queens, there are no checkmate in the position, and black is just up a healthy pawn. Bishop g7, queen g7, fg, knight f6, and now black actually built the fortress as the queen starting to substitute our bishop, holding off this all-important h8 square. Now, if that h8 square wasn't protected, we would be in big trouble. But in this scenario, with no mate on h8 and no tripling on the h file, black is the one dominating. g5 is always a good sign, because after knight h5, the h file is closed off, and it is black who will be calling the shots on the other side. Knight ce2, knight c4. A typical idea, you're trying to put pressure on the queen and the pawn on b2, sometimes even the bishop on e3. And if white decides to take on c4, that again just reduces the firepower that white has. Queen b4, a5. Tony Miles isn't waiting for a second, he is rushing down the board, trying to create weaknesses around Ljubojević's king. Queen b7, knight e5, c3, check, here, queen b6, queen e5. Centralizing the queen, and that's what's most important, and also putting pressure on the e-pawn, eyeing the queen side of white. Bishop c2, but this is already losing, because after rook b8, white has to take on a5, and here comes the big bombshell, rook takes b2. Now if you move the king away, there is rook takes c2, knight takes c2, and knight b3 check. It's a fork, and if you take, then there's queen takes a5, losing the queen. But after king takes b2, then the prosaic knight d3 wins the queen, and it's no wonder that after this, black won as Ljubojević resigned versus Tony Miles. I really hope you enjoyed this little lecture on the essentials that you need to know. So the main takeaway should be that whenever your opponent plays bishop h6 way too early, always think about an exchange sacrifice on c3. Also, if your opponent goes for a heavy attack with g4, h5, always remember that you'll either have to involve your queen in defending the g5 square or bringing in the rook via the 5th rank. So thank you for watching and hope to see you next time.